Hey, what's up everyone? Ian Stewart here, and welcome back to week 2 of Dynamic EQ and Multiband Compression. So, as promised, this week we're going to get into some of the multiband compression examples. And specifically, we're going to be taking a look at 2 methods of doing upward multiband compression. Alright, so again, big thank you to Jordan for providing all the music that we're using. Let's just get right into it, shall we? So the first example we're going to use is going to be on this electro house track again. All right, and basically what we're going to be looking to do with upward compression is to bring the level of the quiet sounds up. Okay. Before we get into the details of that, I just want to talk about some of the general philosophy behind multiband compression. And a few ways that you can hopefully keep yourself out of trouble, okay? First thing to point out is that you'll notice I'm actually still in dynamic phase mode. So technically this is a 3-band dynamic EQ, but we're using it kind of in the same fashion we would use a 3-band multiband compressor. So first let's talk about how you're gonna pick your crossover points, okay? The key here is to not break any kind of instrument up too obviously right in the middle of its kind of body, okay? So what I mean by that is that, let's just turn actual processing off for all 3 bands here, and then we can solo them. So let's start by listening to the low band. What we're going to be looking for is trying to find a place where we've got all the kick in the bass, and not too much of whatever's coming above it, okay? So let's just take a listen. Okay, so you can hear we're capturing it all pretty well. We're getting a little bit of some of those higher elements, some of the pads and stuff are creeping in, which is totally to be expected. But if we lower it too much, it's going to start to get real subby. And if we go into the mid band now, some of that bass and kick information is going to start creeping through into it. Okay, so that's how I kind of arrived at that. There, let me just get this back to where it was. Okay, perfect. All right, so that takes care of your first crossover frequency. Then you just got to find the high one. So again, we're going to try and find a balance between where those upper instruments start to kind of turn into the more air band, right? So let's just listen to this upper band here. Okay, so there's some pitch information in there, but it's not real well defined. And if we bring this crossover point down, we're going to start to get some of that kind of more pitched melodic information, which is really what we want to leave for the middle band, okay? So that's kind of a quick rundown on picking your crossover points. Just try and pick 2 or 3 maybe, where you're not really obviously splitting something in half. The next thing is how many crossovers do you use? How many bands do you use? I know like the default in Ozone opens up with, I think, 5. Generally speaking, I would never say you would need to use more than 3. If you do, you're probably getting into a scenario where maybe a little dynamic EQ before it could be used, or it should really be something that could be fixed in the mix. A lot of times, 2 might actually be enough, and we'll see an example of that later on, probably sometime next week. But 3 is generally sufficient, okay? So why multiband compression in the first place, right? Why even bother? Well, low frequency information in a mix always carries the most energy. It's just kind of the nature of sound and how it works. So by virtue of that low energy information is always going to be what triggers a broadband compressor, like a standard bus compressor, the hardest, right? Your kick and your bass is going to be the first thing to hit it, and it's going to make everything else kind of duck and pump with it. So one way to avoid that is to roll that information out of the internal sidechain in a bus compressor, and that is done. That's commonly done, actually. But then you're not actually getting any compression on your bass. So the main thing with a multiband compressor is that you can compress your bass and everything else separately. And now your kick and your bass don't make the rest of the mix pump. All right? Being able to control that kind of air band on top and have a different amount of compression and not have anything in the mids or bass affect it is kind of an added bonus. But again, 3 bands is really kind of the most you usually need. All right. Next tip before we just look at some of the specifics. Keep it simple. Use the same ratio on all 3 bands. Use the same or very similar attack and release times. Start with the same threshold and then adjust them to taste so you're getting similar amounts of gain reduction in each band. Okay? You can go crazy and have different settings for each one and really solo it and try and dial it in. But what you'll find most of the time is that you'll get wildly different amounts of gain reduction going on in each band. And you'll adjust the makeup differently, or maybe it has auto makeup gain. And then your spectral balance will have been totally altered. And that's what throws a lot of people at first, is that they throw this multiband compressor on, and all of a sudden the overall EQ of their sound sounds totally different, not just the dynamics of it. But by keeping most of the settings for the bands the same, all the bands are kind of acting the same way. They sound like the same kind of compressor. They're just doing their jobs individually on that band. So that's what we've got set up here. We've got a ratio of 1.5 to 1. Again, we're doing upward compression here. So what that means is that when the signal drops below the threshold, which in this case is 17.5 decibels, it'll start to turn the signal up by a ratio of 1.5 to 1. Okay, so for every 1.5 dB below the ratio that the signal goes, the compressor will effectively add 0.5 decibel of gain, allowing it to only drop 1 dB. Okay, we've got a real gentle knee, 36 dB knee, so that's just kind of smoothing out that transition point. A long attack to allow some kind of breathing room in there, and then a real short release so that once we get back above the threshold, it doesn't add any gain to it. All right. So let's just take a before and after listen here. So this is with it in, and now we'll take it out. All right, so what you may just kind of notice is that there's this gentle kind of thickening of the sound. It's not bringing down any of the peaks at all. It's still very punchy, but it's kind of bringing up that bottom information and generally making everything sound just a little bit fuller and richer. So that's one way of doing upward multiband compression. And upward compression can just be very effective. It's not as obvious, generally speaking. And it can just kind of bring the overall average level up without affecting your peaks too much. All right. Next, let's take a excuse me. Let's take a quick look at how we did it on the rock track. On the rock track, we did parallel multiband compression. So, as you may recall from video number 2, parallel compression is a form of upward compression, but done with a downward compressor and blending that downward compressed signal in with the dry signal. Okay, so this is the same audio effect rack that we used in tutorial number 2, but it's just got a multiband compressor in it. All right, so let's pop this open and take a look at the settings. So you can see here, the range is set as low as we can go. And the range is in Pro-MB basically just means what's the maximum amount of either gain reduction or gain addition that the plugin can do to the signal. So this means here we can turn it down by up to 30 dB per band. Pretty aggressive ratio, 6:1. Still a bit of a soft knee, not quite as soft as the previous example. And a real fastest attack we can get, and a really fast release too. All right, so let's start by just listening. Well, I guess let's just listen to the track first. Hold on a second. Before we do that, I forgot to mention something very important. You'll notice here we're in linear phase mode. Now, why is this important? You might wonder. What happens if you do parallel EQing? That is, whether it's a crossover or just an EQ band and it's traditional minimum phase, that is, there's phase shift and group delay associated with the slope and Q and steepness of that filter band. If you blend that back in with the dry signal, you're going to get really obvious phasing. Now, sometimes that can actually work to your favor. Check out Fab Filter's channel. They have a really great video on that. I'll actually link to that below. Incredibly well explained. But suffice to say, since we're blending the compressed signal, which is run through these crossovers, back with the dry signal, it's really advantageous to use linear phase here. All right. So now let's go ahead and just listen to the track first. All right, so what's sticking out to me is the kick drum really kind of punches through, is almost too dynamic. And the bass is a little inconsistent, and overall maybe just could have a little bit more air. So we've got this multi-band compressor set up. Take a look real quick. Crossover, low crossover around 150, a little below. High around 3.2K. And again, if we look, the threshold is the same in each band. Ratio is the same. Attack and release times are the same. All right, keeping it simple. But again, pretty low threshold and very aggressive ratios in attack and release times. So let's take a listen with just the multi-band compressor. So you can hear we're making it a lot brighter because we're doing so much compression. It's affecting that spectral balance. Even keeping it simple when you're doing that much won't be enough to kind of save you from some spectral changes. But what we can do is blend that in with the dry signal to kind of make the effect a little more subtle. So I'll bring this multi-band compression chain all the way down and slowly bring it back up. We'll bypass real quick. All right, so it's making everything definitely a little bit fuller, raising the overall level, certainly. making things a little bit brighter because this multiband compressed variant is so much brighter. The other thing it's starting to do is it's kind of evening out that kick a little bit and evening out the bass. So just by adding that underneath, some things are jumping out a little bit less than they were, and already it's starting to glue together. All right, so those are two examples of upward multiband compression, two different ways to achieve it. So yeah, that's going to be it for this video. If you haven't already, please like, subscribe, share it around, all that good stuff. Next week, we're going to look at a couple different ways of doing downward compression, downward multiband compression, and talk about how sometimes you just need some good old-fashioned bus compression. And then in week 4, we'll wrap it all up, look at how we kind of set some delimiters, and do just some A/B listening. All right, so that's it for this week. I'll see you next time. Bye.